Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, from the day that Biden came into office in the United States, we've all wondered how exactly the relationship with Russia would play out, and the very same issues that existed under the tenure of Donald Trump still very much exist, and even before that, in fact, issues like Ukraine and other such issues where the two countries do very much disagree, be it also those treaties, etc. as well. Now, one of the issues that has also just come up is also the Arctic military and the Arctic overall and military activities in that region, even though there has now been a meeting, in fact, between the Russian foreign minister as well as the U.S. Secretary of State, in which both of them seemingly have come out saying that it was a fairly positive meeting and that the two sides may possibly be coming closer together, though that may be an overstatement at this point in time, regardless, of course, of their differences and possible areas of mutual interest as well around the world, not just when it comes to Russia, its own borders, Russia's complaints about NATO expansionism, as well as, of course, Western and European complaints about Russian encroachment upon Ukrainian territories, etc. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Pasha Sharikov, who is an analyst and senior research fellow and an independent expert. He's joining us today from the Russian capital, Moscow. Joining us from Toronto is Dr. Zachary Paikin, who is a researcher for the Center for European Policy Studies. Zachary and Pasha, thank you both for taking our time out to join us today. Pasha, I'd like to start with you. What is the Russian point of view when it comes to the Arctic? Because I know that that's something that's quickly heating up. Obviously, within the context of climate change, I would think that that was something to be expected. But Putin has come out quite strongly. And I mean, his statement, I'm reading it right now, says something like, "We will knock out everyone's teeth." I mean, that's quite a blatant statement to make when it comes to, Arctic and it being very contentious because of its mineral resources.
Thank you very much for having me. Yes, Arctic is it's not a new topic in Russian-American relations, but rather a new wave of deterioration on this particular issue. So yes, Arctic is a region that Russia considered to be its strategic interests, and whatever military buildup is going on with the United States, China, or Canada, Russian authorities consider to be a threat, and that is why there is certain escalation in the Arctic region.
Zachary, what are your thoughts about that? As I said, and as Pasha there just mentioned, this is not completely unexpected, but nevertheless, with climate change, this will only get worse?
Well, that's certainly the trend that is most easy to identify right now. There is unquestionably a fear that great power rivalry that is beginning to engulf other theaters in the world might permeate the Arctic region, and therefore the Arctic region will not be, as was explicitly the goal of the Arctic Council, insulated from geopolitical dynamics in other theaters. That being said, I think that there's some cause for optimism here, seeing as despite some of the rhetoric that you highlighted in your introduction right there that is directed at a domestic audience, a more honest appraisal of the situation indicates that Russia's goals in the Arctic region do differ from those, say, for example, in the Euro-Atlantic theater. They're much more geared towards the status quo, towards development and exports. And so, Russia does have a long-term interest in Arctic stability, and I think that it's something that we should foster. And my guess is that in their chairmanship of the Arctic Council, Russia will adopt a decidedly different tone and posture from what we've seen, in other theaters where it has adopted a much more assertive posture.
As I said in my intro, we've all been looking to see what Biden's approach will be towards Russia, right? Ever since coming to office, because Donald Trump was always accused of being close to or cozy with Vladimir Putin. Is Biden going to be the polar opposite? Has he already started down that path?
I believe that Biden administration is looking for a predictable and stable relations with Russia. That doesn't mean the improvement or any rapprochement or any more warm relations with Russia, but rather what I believe Henry Kissinger called realpolitik, when the United States defend their own national interests, and they don't expect any much more from Russia.
And what are your thoughts on that, Zachary? Because under Donald Trump, as I said, there was this, there was a lot of talk about Russian collusion in elections, Russian support for Donald Trump throughout his tenure.
But during the Trump administration, I'd say that U.S.-Russia relations were more dysfunctional than anything else, right? You had Donald Trump himself, who was touting the possible benefits of cooperation with Russia, even as his own administration, was pursuing a very hard line vis-a-vis Russia. And then, of course, there's the dimension of Congress in there as well. So, by and large, the relationship was not friendly under the Donald Trump administration, and it's not going to be friendly now under the Joe Biden administration either. I don't think anyone should be fooled into thinking that these most recent talks indicate a reset of any sort. This is going to remain primarily an adversarial relationship, and the big question is, can it be a stable adversarial relationship? And up until now, it by and large appears not to have been. But as the dust sort of from the Ukraine crisis, although it may remain a hot conflict, while the dust from that conflict gradually settles in the sense that the Euro-Atlantic security system becomes clearer, in the sense that Russia is not going to be an integral part of the West, I think that eventually creates space for a more honest relationship, one that's based on deterrence rather than what the analyst Michael Kaufman calls an active pressure campaign. And if it's one based on deterrence, and deterrence by definition needs to include reassurance and confidence-building measures as well, then there might be, some selective areas for dialogue and de-escalation. Because in the context of an active pressure campaign, there's no reason for either side to make concessions. There's no reason for Russia in particular, as the weaker party, to make concessions, because they believe that will only lead to further demands to make further concessions. If that if that dynamic can be sort of reined in a little bit and brought towards a more stable dynamic of deterrence, I think already that would go a long way to stabilizing the relationship.
Glad you mentioned Ukraine there, Zachary, because Pasha, I wanted to ask you on the Ukraine issue. Yes, we recently had that military buildup of the Russians close to the Ukrainian border, and then that was seemingly pulled back at some point, even though the Russians said that they had no intentions to, for example, invade Ukraine and or take over any territory of that country. Just on the issue of Ukraine overall, will there be more of a resolution in that regard, or is this essentially just a stalemate which will continue?
Well, the events in Russian-Ukrainian relations are growing. And I believe just after the Lavrov-Blinken meeting in Reykjavik, there was a report that President Putin is planning his meeting with President Zelensky, which he denied in the first place, or at least left with no comment. So probably there were certain discussions, or more even certain agreements between Russia and the United States about Ukraine. And yes, there were reports that Russia was building military forces on the border with Ukraine, and later there were reports that Russia withdrew certain weapons from Ukraine. But again, since Russian military is quite a closed structure, it is very difficult to have any hard data to prove these reports.
Pasha, I'd like to stick for a moment more about that topic because, it's been because of Ukraine mainly, right, and possibly other issues too, such as human rights, that a lot of sanctions have been placed upon Russia, or a significant amount of sanctions have been placed upon Russia. Has that, do you think, changed the population's point of view as well about Ukraine and whether or not these stances are worth it for the country to take?
The opinion of Russian population is largely influenced by Russian official media position, which obviously say the official Russian position. And Ukraine is not considered to be an independent actor, but rather some form of relations with the United States, some territory for competition against Washington, some form of competition against NATO. So I don't think that Moscow considers Ukraine to be an independent sovereign actor.
Wonderful. Okay, so Zachary, I wanted to ask you on that same point then, because the Russian point of view that Pasha there just outlined is something that I've heard from other Russia experts as well. From your vantage point, though, what is and where is the situation with Ukraine headed between the Russians and the Ukrainians? Because it seems that the Americans very much are still in the midst of this, and that the Ukrainians, as much as they do want to join NATO, that's probably not going to happen anytime in the near-term future. So these two need to learn to get along because they are in the same neighborhood?
Yes, in theory, but I agree very much with Pasha's characterization that, and in fact, I think it extends beyond Ukraine. I think that Russia believes that the European Union isn't a sovereign actor either, and that it's effectively just, the economic arm of NATO. And there have been many opportunities to illustrate in the past that NATO and the EU are two different beasts, but unfortunately, they've not been seized upon. And the result is that basically the only peer competitor that Russia really recognizes at this point is the United States, and that, by definition, does not lend itself to a potentially stable Euro-Atlantic theater. You can find elements of stability within rivalry there, but there's no fundamental historical resolution of problems that can occur in that type of situation. The relationship right now between Russia and Ukraine under President Zelensky has, unfortunately, despite Zelensky's early efforts, partial efforts, I should say, to try to expend a significant amount of political capital on moving the peace process forward in the eastern Donbass. Unfortunately, it appears as if the relationship is more or less back to where it was under President Poroshenko, which is to say that both leaders in both countries are largely speaking to a domestic audience, and unfortunately, the domestic audience in Ukraine and in Russia has, since the start of the Ukraine crisis 7 years ago, been radicalized on this issue. And it's true in the West as well, that the West has also emerged radicalized from this process and not able to make the level-headed discussions and concessions necessary to bring this crisis to a resolution. So unfortunately, I'm not optimistic as to where things are going forward.
One of the things that struck me as odd is the I don't know if the right word is obsession, but the American obsession with Nord Stream 2 and that pipeline project with Germany and Europe overall. And the idea that Russia will have a lot of political influence because it'll be sharing energy with the Europeans, which I imagine there are arguments for that. But then there was talk about sanctioning companies, and now there's been talk of a waiver on sanctions on those companies that are involved in that project. What are your thoughts about that entire issue? Because it seems that in a sense, Washington was telling the Europeans that they shouldn't have independent policymaking almost when it comes to their own energy needs?
This issue is, again, one of many, many issues which are subject to American domestic political competition between the Democratic and the Republican Party. And if you look closely, you will see that the official Washington position has slightly changed with the coming of the Democratic administration, Joseph Biden. But in Russia, the recent decision on the Nord Stream 2, basically lifting the sanctions or not introducing the sanctions, has been met as a concession from the United States to Russia, which I believe is rather a result of an agreement between the United States and Germany. So obviously the Democratic Party politicians were condemned by the Republican politicians for making this decision. And I'm not sure that this question is closed. I'm not sure that this particular deal is closed. And, obviously these sanctions will be re-estimated within 90 days, and there is no guarantee that they won't be introduced in the nearest future.
All right, Zachary, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go on the issue of Nord Stream 2. At some point, I believe it was under Donald Trump, if I'm not mistaken, that the Americans said, listen, instead of buying Russian energy and gas, buy American LNG, which I believe, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is more expensive. So it almost seemed when that came out that this was more of an economic warfare than anything else, where the Americans were like, no, buy from us instead of the Russians, because, in a sense, we want to make money.
Well, there's definitely no doubt in many European circles that the view exists that the United States was not, predominantly interested in necessarily the security of several European states when making the statements that you were just referring to, but that they were interested primarily in selling their own gas to the Europeans. Especially from the German perspective, Germany believes in rules-based multilateralism, and it also believes in business and commerce and trade. And so a pipeline that's agreed between two countries, from their point of view, only has commercial implications and should not be subject to unilateral sanctions from a given superpower. And I agree very much with again, I don't know if that position is going to hold, because obviously as the Russia-EU relationship has deteriorated, obviously geopolitical considerations and political considerations regarding the desires of some of the smaller members of the European Union do very much come into the equation. But I agree very much with Pasha's characterization there, that this is primarily a deal between the United States and Germany, because Biden effectively wants to restore alliances and the transatlantic relationship. And so at the end of the day, the U.S. hasn't very verily resolved or changed rather its posture of primacy that it wants to pursue in the Euro-Atlantic theater. It's not verily treating Russia as a peer competitor as much as Russia wants to be seen as a peer competitor, and as much as Russia treats the United States certainly as a peer competitor. And so the result is that when you do treat these non-Western, non-liberal powers as second-tier actors effectively in the international system, you're going to end up with a rivalrous state of affairs. And I agree that this very much the future of this deal between the United States and Germany for now is very much up in the air.
Well, they're at that, but we really appreciate both Dr. Pasha Sharikov and Dr. Zachary Paikin for taking their time out, speaking to us respectively there from Moscow and Toronto, sharing their expert insight with us about the latest when it comes to Russia-U.S. relations. A whole host, long list of issues, and we've discussed this many times in this show, but the waiver when it comes to Nord Stream 2 may be seen as a concession, as Pasha there had mentioned, on the part of the Russian population, at least when it comes to relations between those two countries. However, this may, in fact, have a lot more to do with American-German relations than anything else. There is then the issue of Ukraine, which still very much exists. Human rights is also an issue which the Americans keep talking about when it comes to Russia. Nevertheless, the meeting between Blinken and Lavrov, they both seemingly came out fairly positive. It's hard to, of course, understate or overstate what that may mean at this point in time because of the vast differences between these two countries, both close to Russian territories and around the world. I mean, we can talk about the Middle East, we can talk about Venezuela. I mean, there's so many areas where these two disagree and have great influence, and even Afghanistan possibly. So we'll keep a very close eye on the relations between those two countries because it's still very much a wait-and-see game how Biden's going to develop these relations going forward. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, as we know, overnight, there was a ceasefire announced between Hamas and Israel. So at this point in time, we do have a ceasefire in place. Nevertheless, it's not really a question of who won, right? Because I would think that is probably what's happening right now on both sides, as in a discussion about who really came out on top. In the middle, as we know, have been Gazans and Palestinians, even across the occupied territories, who have been in the firing line. Many of them have lost their homes, especially in the context of Gaza, lost their lives in significant numbers, unfortunately. And just as we're coming on air right now, we have gotten news that the Al-Aqsa compound is also being raided by Israeli forces after Friday prayers. Palestinians had gathered for Friday prayers, and then there was a celebration, seemingly, of the truce that is now in place at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and there was an attempt to control and or have that celebration be limited at this time at the Al-Aqsa compound. Let's discuss all of this a bit further because there's quite a bit to get through really when we're talking about a ceasefire, what this really means for the future at this point in time. We're joined now by Dr. Susan Akram, who is a law professor. She's also the director of Boston University's School of Law's International Human Rights Clinic. She's joining us this morning from Boston, Massachusetts. Joining us from Ottawa, Canada is Dr. Nahla Abdo, who is a professor of sociology and anthropology at Carleton University. And joining us from Rome is Dr. Lorenzo Kamel, who is a professor of history of Middle East and North Africa at the University of Turin. He's also director of research studies at Istituto Affari Internazionali. Lorenzo, Nahla, and Susan, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Lorenzo, I'd like to start with you. As I said, in such a situation, there really are no winners, but this time around did seem different than previous times. I mean, I've covered the previous conflicts regarding Gaza, 2014, and the previous one as well as a journalist. And this time it felt like there was more of an outpouring, more awareness on the part of, I'm saying, more of the global community. Have things changed? Have the dynamics changed? And what does that then mean for the future?
Yes, first of all, let me start by pointing out that framing this conflict it's a war between Israel and Hamas, as your words were in fact suggesting, is misleading because, as you said, we should avoid to hide behind Hamas the life of millions of Palestinians. So now there is a ceasefire. It's a great news for everyone, of course, but then there is a lot of debates about restoring order. So we should ask to ourselves, what does it mean restoring order? So after the ceasefire, there will be order, meaning that we will have a situation in which Jewish Israelis, will start to have again a more or less normal life with rights and so on. And this, of course, this is important and welcome. But at the same time, we will have also millions of Palestinians that will continue to live in a legal limbo. So without a state, without a citizenship of any country. And this is a case unique in the world in the sense that, of course, in this case, we have a population and since more than half a century are both without a state and both without citizenship. And then let me also point out very briefly that I share your point about that something is changing, and there is something big is changing at the global level. People are discussing issues that, often they were also kind of a taboo. But at the same time, I want to add that I see two levels. On one hand, I see leaderships, also leadership of our countries, and in that respect, I don't see any change. While I see public opinions, both in Western countries and in this region, that also thanks to technology, to social media, to the time that we are living, somehow we are somehow taking a stance and they are discussing these issues. So I agree with you that this is a major change.
Lorenzo, for pointing out the terminology, and I know that that's extremely important to use the right terminology when it comes to what's happened recently. And war possibly was not the correct term to use. It's not a battle between two equal sides or two sides that were equally attacking each other with an equal amount of offensive, defensive. I mean, I don't want to get too much into that or bog down into that, but it's an extremely important discussion to use the right terminology. Nahla, I wanted to go to you and ask you about your thoughts about now that we have the ceasefire in place. What are the lessons learned here, if any?
Well, I agree with my colleague by saying that at the popular level, actually, there has been change. You notice it among the Palestinians. I mean, we're talking Palestinians, those in the occupied territories of 1967, but also those who are citizens of the Israeli state. And, their support and solidarity actually with their brothers and sisters in Gaza and in Jerusalem has been, I think, unprecedented. And this is changed. So at the level of the Palestinian communities, all of them, the change is very much visible. Change also is at the international level. And I agree, it is the new social media that has if you want, valorized or showed that change globally and not just locally. The interaction with the media, the kind of photos that came out, especially with this new technique called TikTok, actually just, amazing. And they, as you know, they travel from one space to the other in no time. Yeah. So changes at the local and international level, popular level, is very clear. Changes in terms of the Israeli policies and practices, changes in terms of the very structure of the Israeli state as a settler colonial state. I doubt major change is going to happen. And this is the major problem that we are facing. In your introduction, you mentioned the troubles in Jerusalem have, to a certain extent, been resumed. So this is one indication that changes in terms of how Israel is going to conduct itself vis-a-vis, occupied Palestinians or colonized Palestinians. This is something to think about.
Indeed. Susan, what are your thoughts about this in the context of what has happened vis-a-vis even the media response and media coverage of what's happened, right? So we have, as with previous times as well, with these situations surrounding Gaza and the occupied territories, we've had a controversy about the terminology used, killed versus died, when we're talking about Palestinians versus Israelis, for example. But then even within mainstream media, we did have pockets of journalists coming out quite blatantly and talking about what's really happening. Has that changed, do you think, as well? Because that would be a very vital change as well to observe. Right?
Yes, I think there are actually two changes on this side of the globe. that are quite dramatic. The first is the one that you've just pointed out, which is the change in the media. I have not heard on CNN and BBC, for example, the Palestinian voices and the Palestinian perspective in the way that I have heard in the last week. It's really quite astonishing. Palestinian perspectives on the occupation, naming the occupation, which you do not hear in terms of establishing who has the right to bear arms and who does not in this conflict. We started out with sort of focusing on no two equal sides. Well, the law actually makes that clear, but unless you frame this as an occupation, you don't understand that Israel does not have the right to use arms or let alone disproportionate force against a population that it's occupying. On the other hand, the Palestinians, who are the occupied population, do have the right to use whatever means necessary to regain their sovereignty and self-determination. So having these perspectives now for the first time in mainstream media, to me, is really rather astonishing. But the second really important change in the United States is the change in Congress. Yesterday, for the very first time in my lifetime, both houses of Congress proposed a joint resolution to halt President Biden's latest arms sale to Israel that was going to just go through, as usual, $735 million of arms that was going to go through, one would normally expect, no opposition. But for the first time, we had opposition in both houses. Now, I don't know what has happened to that vote that went last night, so that remains to be seen. But pushback from within Congress is astonishing.
Lorenzo, for a moment, I wanted to, because I know you're a Middle East, North Africa expert as well, I wanted to talk about those countries, especially those countries that normalize ties with Israel via the Abraham Accords. And what lessons do you think that those countries are taking away from what happened recently? Because, in my point of view, at least, there seems to be some egg on their face. Am I correct to say that?
I believe that no lesson will be gained. I think that this country have shown repeatedly that is quite useful to exploit the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian sufferance. This started already 70 years ago, and this today probably is even more visible. So I believe that there are too many interests, and that this is not enough to change much. Okay, let me also add one little point connected to the discussion that we're having. I personally think that Hamas in many ways is a disgrace for Palestinians, and I think that the rockets threatening Israeli cities are certainly immoral and counterproductive. The problem is that what is missing, I mean, of course, I'm an historian, so I can imagine that it's more visible for me, but what is missing is context. So media are discussing all these issues without asking from where Hamas comes from. Look like it really is coming from Mars and is not the product of a very specific context. Just very briefly, because we don't have time. Yep. Somehow mainstream media not focus, for example, on the fact that the Gaza Strip, of course, is composed mainly by refugees. Many of them were expelled in 1948 from Najd, from Jura, from Mashdal, present-day Oraner, Sderot. There are all some people that are coming from this neighboring area. These villages were very often raised to the ground by the Israeli Defense Force in order to prevent the return of these inhabitants. And what is missing also is the fact that this population of Gaza remain largely apolitical and very hesitant toward the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, the precursor of Hamas. And this is very often missing. And what is also missing is that the number of mosques in the Gaza Strip passed from 200 in 1967 to 600 in 19 1987 when Hamas was established. And of course, this has much to do with the martial law that these people live for 20 years. So, I mean, I would like to discuss about these issues much. And I want to stress once again that I really perceive Hamas sometimes it looks more interested in fighting Israel than really supporting his own people. In any case, sometimes, I mean, you really look that something is missing there. So I strongly denounce many of the techniques used by Hamas. But really, what is missing is all this background, and without this background, really, we cannot understand anything.
Exactly. You know, Nahla, as Lorenzo there said, regardless of Hamas's tactics, and that can, of course, be debated, and that has been debated many, many times, there is very little context provided, as he said, to why Hamas even exists, really. What are your thoughts about that? Was that, do you think, addressed this time around, or is that something that is still seemingly not understood?
Let me begin by saying that it's not just Hamas who are the resistance forces in Gaza. It is time now for everyone, East and West, to recognize, actually, that there are different Palestinian political factions everywhere. Throughout Palestine, and that is from the very beginning, from the 60s within the PLO. So you have the Popular Front, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is Hamas, which was not part of the PLO, but at least grew to have actually a large base, and you have a group of Mujahideen, which is Saraya al-Quds, who are, if not, equally powerful in terms of their resistance methods. Then they are, probably even more powerful than Hamas. Not much talk, sort of comes to explain the differences that are there in terms of the different fractions. This is one thing to begin with. But if we take into consideration international laws that accept that any occupied, any colonized group has the right to defend themselves from colonialism and from occupation, I think the whole question of where did Hamas or the others come from becomes redundant. There is no need for this question. Hamas is part of Gaza. Gaza is part of the Palestinians, all the Palestinians. Yeah. Now it is a bit more radical because you have forced it to become what it is by surrounding it for the past 15 years now, with hardly anything coming in and going out. So you starve a whole population, and you don't want it to basically respond or resist. So this is a legitimate part of the Palestinian resistance. Palestinian resistance takes different forms. This is one form, which is armed form, and I think we should take it as normal as we took any resistance movement anywhere in the world. And Hamas is not different. I really don't care if anyone thinks that it is immoral to throw a rocket, but it is immoral to throw bombs on the heads of children and women and men, and collapse a whole building on the heads of these people. It is totally, equally immoral, if not more, actually. Hamas does not have, the jets. Hamas does not have the air flights. Hamas does not have any of these things. Hamas is a resistant movement, and it is a legitimate one. Let me just add one quick.
Sure, just briefly if you can. Yeah, please go ahead. Yep.
I'll try to make it as quick as possible. The previous, sorry, I forgot her name, our colleague here on the panel, talked about Susan, you spoke about changes within the Biden cabinet, or within the Biden sort of, ruling circles. These changes actually are only one part of a larger thing that happened. Biden was able to really empty the United Nations 3 different statements that they wanted to come up with in the past 3 or 4 days. We could have really spared more bloodshed on the part of the Palestinians if Biden agreed to the ceasefire earlier. But he kept delaying, and he kept giving Israel more chance to destroy as many people as possible. And this is very clear. Biden, as everyone knows, wished to have been born as Jew.
Okay, I'm going to come in, Nahla. I do apologize. We're going to get Susan back into the conversation. In fact, Susan, what are your thoughts about what Nahla there said to you regarding, of course, Biden and his delay? Because that was something, and I'm sure you are well aware of this. He was, vastly criticized by many, many human rights experts regarding the vetoes on the calls for ceasefires. And secondly, about this issue of Hamas as well, I'm curious to know your thoughts about that also.
Yes, so on the first point, I wasn't actually speaking about the Biden administration. I was speaking about Congress, that there is pressure coming on the Biden administration from within Congress for the first time. I don't have great expectations for Biden, although he has some very good people on his team, also for the first time, Palestinian Americans on his Middle East team. Another element that is new, but the orders, it's clear that he is giving them, is very much back to the pro-Israeli position. So what I'm talking about is this new group of Congress people and senators who are really pushing for change. Now, whether there's going to be a large enough bloc and whether they're going to have strength enough to change the administration, that remains to be seen. On the second point on Gaza, on Hamas in Gaza, I'm not an expert on Hamas, but I completely agree with Nahla. Hamas is a resistance organization, and the Palestinians are entitled to choose whomever they want to represent them and to represent their struggle. Just as the Israelis have chosen someone like Bibi Netanyahu, who, to my mind, is without doubt a war criminal, but also maybe cynically doing some of what he's doing in order to stave off the corruption criminal charges that he's facing. I put absolutely nothing past this individual. And if we are going to talk about poor leadership, I think we really need to look at what the Israeli government is doing and whether it's serving its own people. But I completely agree with Nahla. The Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, they are entitled to be among the resistance forces of the Palestinian people until they achieve the self-determination that the entire international community and the United Nations has recognized they're entitled to. Yeah. And the recognition of the state that the United Nations already has voted to approve.
We're quickly running out of time, so Lorenzo, I'll just give you a minute and a half, if possible, just as a last word. I wanted to move just past Hamas for a moment and talk about the main Palestinian leadership, i.e. the leadership in Ramallah. And, there's been, as you're well aware, Lorenzo, a lot of criticism of it just from, its fairly muted, weak position, if I may use those phrases and terms. Do you think that it has, in some senses, lost legitimacy?
Okay, just let me briefly into what was saying before. Let me remind to anyone that about 54% of the population in Gaza is under 18 years old. So they never voted for anyone, and Hamas wasn't behind the Jerusalem protests. It's very problematic the attempt to hijack these protests, because the Palestinian cause will it's powerful enough, is not needed for the techniques used for Hamas. In fact, the moment in which Hamas hijacked this very powerful protest, somehow all the issues that were at the center stage move in direction to Hamas. And this is problematic in a number of ways. Then I fully share what was said about the Netanyahu administration, the Likud. The Likud, it's the part of the Israel Prime Minister rejects the creation of a Palestinian state. It was never retracted. And also at Oslo, and I really conclude this part, but in 1993, we know that the Palestinians recognized Israel's right to exist, while Israel never recognized the right for a Palestinian state. They just recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the representative of the Palestinian. It's really different, the two things. And we can broaden this to Atikva, to Abata Yehudi, to also to Yamina Hadash, that is the party of Ayelet Shaked that was posting on Facebook a few years ago a call for a genocide without distancing herself from this. So what I want to say is that the two things, we don't have to compare necessarily with something for saying that this Palestinian, the Palestinian cause, I think that is powerful enough, does not need from the technique used from Hamas for winning. Then moving very briefly to your specific question, I think that Abu Mazen, that is a sort of dictator nowadays. I mean, inspired this role more than 10 years ago, and has a very strong interest in common with Netanyahu to avoid any election, because of course he's afraid of winning of Hamas. But in order to prevent this, in order to prevent the Hamas as such a role, we need to go to the structural reasons for this conflict. Only at that moment we can prevent this. And also a very, very last point, there are many organizations of youth, Palestinian youth organizations that are growing, but they don't have enough space for having an impact.
We're going to leave it there at that, but we really, really appreciate Lorenzo, Nahla, and Susan. We got through quite a bit. So we spoke about the right of self-defense, essentially, if I might phrase it that way. We spoke about what the ceasefire, this truce, however we want to term it, will mean now going forward. What were the lessons learned? What changes occurred during this latest bout of violence? And, you know, as a journalist, I'm very, very well aware the terminology is extremely, extremely important in these regards. We have to be very sensitive to the words that we use to describe what occurred. Palestinians are, according to international law, an occupied people. That's an undeniable fact. And so these sorts of incidences, when they do happen, need to be termed very carefully. And we need to be very careful about how then we approach the narrative surrounding them as well, because that then completely changes then our understanding of the situation as well as it's played out on the ground. I'll leave it there at that. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.